We continue with Chapter 2 of developing a director's package application using Microsoft Excel. Now, we've already defined it as a group of accounting reports which the Board of Directors require each month. And we have discussed some of the overall issues, but we will need to get more detailed on the design. We've already formulated our 4-part plan. After this discussion, we'll be able to start dealing with the data, but first we need to plan out the layout of the application. I feel this slide is logical, but does not stick to the structure of our plan. We need a trial balance, we need an import area to hold the current data. Of course, the trial balance is a year-to-date trial balance each month. We need to store that. And then, of course, there's the metadata. The current metadata, like the current date, and standing data, for example, budgets, company name. And then we need work area data, like summaries. It's a good idea to start with a table of contents and list all the things that we want in our application. So one of the things that I do is I just start a tab and I just bash them down, so I know what I'm trying to achieve, and I have some sort of list that I can check off as I go. What do we need in our application as far as output report is concerned? Well, traditionally we need a balance sheet, income statement, cash flow statement. They're pretty basic. Let's just have a look at a model. Here's a finished model, and here is a balance sheet. The balance sheet, as you can see in this report, is actually the balance sheet each month throughout the year. And at this time we were up to November, and this was 2006. The profit and loss account can be done in the same way. We can do profit and loss by internal account. We can do profit and loss by department. We can do profit and loss by account within for each department. So, and then of course, don't forget the cash flow statement. Now, all these reports, you might say, well, how many reports are we going to have? Let's just see. We need a current, we need a trend over time, we need budgets, and we're going to do the balance sheet, income statement, and cash flow statement. We do it for the month, for the quarter, for the year. Okay, now we've got 27 reports. If we added a report, we would add, for example, an equity statement. This would add a dimension, and this means that our total reports is 3 times 3 times 4. So this adds up to 36 reports. In order to produce the desired reports, we need to do a certain amount of updating each month, and of course a major update at the end of the year. Consider the minimum of updating to be the name of the current month. Each month you may need to include some reasons why certain fluctuations and variances have occurred. We should design with these updates in mind and make them easy to do and fast. We do not really like working until 11 o'clock every night, despite what many people think. Looking at our application, here's an input area where we will put in the name of the company, and we can put in the current month number, we can put in the year number, and then we can put in perhaps a date that we want to use for comparisons. Might be last month. And down here I have an area where you're actually going to say, well, in that month we want the actuals. We could have the actuals, the budget, or we could clear it and have no data at all shown in that. So these are all features that we might want to build into our application. Standing data, this is the permanent stuff that's in our application. It's not confined to the company's name, etc. It includes budgets and, of course, the underlying chart of accounts. A trial balance does not include all the active accounts unless you specify it in the report writer. But in our model, we need to have a home or a destination for all the active accounts. So we need to maintain a complete chart of accounts. Often a trial balance report will include only accounts that have a balance. Therefore, January's trial balance will be shorter, in other words, a less number of accounts, than February, just because at the end of the year, all the income statement accounts have been reset to zero balances. So the complete chart of accounts is part of the standing data, or you could call it permanent data, and all our formulas, of course, should access the complete chart. Other historical data has to be stored, such as year-to-date trial balances, monthly trial balances. We need to use this data in comparatives with previous periods and trend reports. Now you'll notice that I have put a caveat in here. We have to stop somewhere, because if we do not, we'll be developing a full-blown database. Remember that and set boundaries, or you'll never be finished. Here is the accounting data in this sheet, and as you can see, this goes on and on and on. Let's go down to the bottom, and you see that we're up to line over here 1188. So have all this data that we're going to use. So what do we need in the current data area? Well, trial balance, year to date and monthly. Totals for each account category. We need the balance sheet with a summary by account categories, profit and loss with summaries by account categories. And we may want to deal with the revenue, the cost of sales, maybe R&D, salaries, general and administrative expenses, non-operating expenses. So they'll come out of the P&L, but we also may want department totals. We may want an analysis of expenses by natural account. We might want to look at our stock option costs, and we may need statistical reports. So let me go back into our model again. Let's go up to A1. Okay, so our first item here that I have is the balance sheet summary, and I just have totals of assets, liability and equity. And we have a profit and loss summary, revenue, operating expenses, non-operating expenses, and then we'll have an analysis by function of cost of sales, R&D, SG&A, and then expenses by department. Here's a list of our departments, and expense by account category. Here's a list of our account categories. Expenses then by cost of sales function and account category. So here's our operating cost of sales, operating R&D and SG&A, and we've got account categories in each that one. We can then have a look at our stock option costs, and we might want to do that by each department, and then we may need to analyze it according to our natural accounts, and we'll leave out our balance sheet at this stage. And then much of the time we'll actually want some statistical data, full-time employees, exempt, non-exempt, overtime, head counts, that type of thing. And finally, on line 371, we actually start our trial balance, and this trial balance goes from line 373 down to 1188. So that may give you some idea of our model. And what I show in this slide is just exactly what I've just shown you in the application, with those headings listed, and we're going to have to set aside areas for those in our workbook. Maintenance. Of course you're going to have to maintain this model, but we're actually not going to go into that in this presentation. So I'm just mentioning it so you don't think I've forgotten it. We're going to go through a number of processes. This means that you actually have to go through this each month, importing the data and maintaining the model. This means you better understand the model and know how to use it. Oh dear, do we have to actually have to understand what we're doing? Wow. Okay, let me say that having mentioned it, I'm going to move on to the process of importing the trial balance, but not in depth at this point. We'll have to go through these three processes each month, where you have to import the data, we have to update the model, and we have to perform whatever maintenance is necessary. Go on to our first process, to import the trial balance year to date. And this comprises preparing to import the data, then actually importing the data, and then verifying the data imported. Since each accounting application does it differently, the bad news is that I will not be able to show you how to do this specifically or universally across every accounting package, but I'll just go through examples. I use MAS and Great Plains and QuickBooks as my examples, so I will actually go through those a bit later on. Suffice it to say, there is a process for doing this, and it has to be learned by the user. Process 2, check the standing data, and the first one we might want to check is our chart of accounts. We have a tab here and we will detail our chart of accounts. Now, chart of accounts will be the account number and the account title. The type of account is either balance sheet or income statement. Then we have a subtype, which is assets, and an account category, which is perhaps cash. Then we may have a department number, and then our natural accounts. So this thing is a whole chart, and of course this goes on down to, how many lines have we got here? We have 822 lines. It's not that big. Okay. Then we check the budget, and we have our budgets for the various months, and we'll have it in the same layout as we've got the actual results, because we will want to compare to budget. We will then check the comparatives, and we'll go through our whole process, and we might even end up with a month-end checklist. When is a checklist applicable? Well, as soon as you have a significant number of steps, you should create a checklist. The checklist I use, I actually have a column for entering the date that item on the checklist was performed. It helps ensure that the checklist has actually been followed and not just ticked off, tick, tick, tick. Now I want to have a little digression from our mainstream. In an application, you can use a macro to set certain switches or open at a particular place every time the workbook is opened by writing an auto open macro. For example, when we click open this application will open at this cover sheet every single time and highlight cell A1. Now, how's that done? Here's the code that opens the workbook at cell A1 of the cover tab and zooms to place a defined area on your screen. So here's your code. You have you actually in a module or a workbook, you actually type in private sub workbook underscore open parens. So here's your subroutine, sorry. With worksheets cover, activate range A1 to O1, select active window, zoom equals true, range A1 select, end with, end sub. And what that will do is it will open the worksheet, it will activate the cover and select the top row from A1 to O1 across the top, and then it will zoom to that selection, and then once it's done that, the selection will change to A1. So fairly simple, really. If you want to see the code, then let's see, I can go back to the previous slide and open this again, and do Control F11, and there we have the code actually in there that's in this worksheet. Now I wanted to comment about your chart of accounts. You have in your chart of accounts the natural account numbers and your descriptions, and note this is the full chart of accounts, not from the current trial balance. We've already mentioned that. You have your account types, subtypes, and then the account categories, and then department codes and titles. Seems we've already looked at that. I'm not going to dwell on that again. Now when you design your chart of accounts, you actually should keep separate lists for each section. Do not wing it, or your chart of accounts will look like it. So you really need to put some effort into designing your chart of accounts. It's actually one of these mission critical tasks. If you are installing a new accounting system, one of the first things that the VAR, the value added reseller, will ask you for when installing your new system is the chart of accounts, and you should not leave it to them to do it for you. Anyway, they probably do not want the responsibility, or they may not even have the capability, since they're techies and not usually accountants. So how many accounts should we have? Should we have a separate account for everything? The answer is have enough, but not too many. So let's just run through. When would I add an account? Well, if there's a need to keep the items separate, or a second reason is if it makes life easier. A third reason, if its separate disclosure is required. Fourth reason, for control purposes. And finally, if it makes reconciliations easier. But whatever your reason, make sure you have a valid one. Okay, you have just heard or just missed Chapter 2, entitled Design of a Director's Package. Tune in again at a theatre near you for the next exciting episode, entitled Chapter 3,